Before getting into the actual sermon, I just wanted to take a minute to talk about Samaritans. So we have this image in our heads, that of course the Jews of the day didn't really like Samaritans, and so the idea that Jesus would use a Samaritan as the example in his parable would be kind of shocking. I don't know that we actually know just how shocking the use of a Samaritan would be in this context. If I think about it, once upon a time, maybe like 30, 40 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, I would have seen Celtic supporters as a good example to use in this parable. I was taught from a very young age that Rangers were the greatest team in all of European football, and that the Celtic was their absolute arch enemies. I heard a story about my uncle walking home from a soccer game and getting cut from the side of his mouth up to his ear with a straight razor because they happened to be walking through Celtic territory and a corner of his scarf was pointing up out of his jacket. Now, is that a true story? Is it apocryphal? I don't know. But there was a level of hatred between the supporters of those two teams. Now, if we look at the story from today's gospel, imagine that 100 times worse. That there was absolutely no love lost between a Samaritan and a Jew. And the idea that two devout Jewish believers, and not only believers but leaders, would pass by a Jewish man in the ditch while a Samaritan would stop and help him was absolutely unthinkable. So much so that if you listen to the story, the person, the legal expert or whoever it is, the scribe, Pharisee, different versions identified this person differently, when asked after hearing the story, who was this man's neighbor, didn't say the Samaritan. He couldn't. What he said was the one who stopped and helped. Okay, so that's a little aside, because I think that it's really important when we hear these stories to really try and put ourselves into the mindset, the heart set of those who would have initially been hearing it, and just how radically different the message that Jesus was offering was from everything they had heard before. So, as Reverend Cheryl and Victoria the week before said, we are in the midst of a series looking at 5 traits of congregations on the move, congregations that are growing, congregations that are fruitful. And today I get to talk about risk-taking mission and service. So I wanted to reflect back on week 1 of the series when Victoria talked about hospitality. So, and then again, when Reverend Cheryl last week talked about worship. So hospitality and worship. And what I'm finding to be even more true now than I might have known even a little while before is just how integrated all of these pieces are. Hospitality cannot be removed from how we understand mission and how we understand service. When Victoria preached, she talked about the passage from Matthew 25, right? And Jesus did not say that you can feed the people you like, or you can feed the people who have a job because they deserve it, or you can clothe the people who are naked but in a certain climate, or that there is no limit to the message that Jesus shares about where that hospitality begins and ends. It's across the spectrum. And then when she kind of dove into it a little bit further, we just saw, remember Victoria's question was, hospitality just seems like a thing, and she was struggling with what makes it radical. Well, I want to raise the same kind of question here. What makes mission and service risk-taking? Like what is it that sets it apart from, because at one time, one of the catchphrases for the United Church of Canada was, we are mission and service. And what that meant was that we are the Mission and Service Fund. And so the work that happens out of the Mission and Service Fund, that is part of what defines us as the United Church of Canada. Oh, by the way, happy anniversary. 96 years this year. And so 4 more, and we hit the big 100, but we have to talk about that. So what is it that makes mission and service, it moves it out of this, it's kind of who we are, to risk-taking. And so we hear the story today from the gospel. And as Reverend Cheryl reminded me, she used part of that reading last week. Now, I kind of knew that, but I was really fixated on the Good Samaritan. Like it was so I kind of forgot that Reverend Cheryl had used the first part of that reading last week when she talked about worship. But the whole idea of all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, everything you are, you love God with that. You give that to God, all of your strength, all of your heart, all of your mind. But then Jesus takes that and he joins it together. He couples it. He takes that passage from Deuteronomy and then he couples it with a passage from Leviticus that says, love your neighbor. And to that question, the legal person, the scribe, the Pharisee says, okay, yeah, sure, but who's my neighbor? Now we jump back to Victoria's sermon, because Jesus' answer is, your neighbor is anybody who happens to be in need. But not only that, your neighbor is anybody who offers you the assistance you need. Trust me, the Samaritan crossing that street and helping that Jewish person who's stuck in the ditch, that was risk-taking for the Samaritan. If he had been seen, there would have been repercussions, not only for the Jewish person in the ditch, but for him. He would have suffered because of the risk that he took to cross that street and to help the person that had already been passed by the Levite and the priest. Okay, so our service. So I'm going to talk about service first, because I kind of want to make a little bit of a distinction between the two. Our service is in those places where the immediate needs of people are made known. So we know that particularly in the winter, people who do not have safe, sustainable, long-term housing, who are living in shelters or elsewhere, living on the streets, there are specific needs that they have. One of those needs is socks. Now, we don't really think about that. I don't think about that. I mean, I have a basket of socks in my bedroom. I go through those socks every Sunday trying to decide which pair of socks I'm going to wear, just because which ones will be most striking on camera. But I don't really give too much thought to the importance of those socks for my feet. But when you talk to someone, when you take the time to learn the realities of people that are different than your own, you find out that socks are really important. for overall health, beginning with the feet. And so this year, I mean, you know, so all of you know, the Embrace Center and what we are about, or some of what we are about. And some of what we're about is meeting those needs of people who drop in, who come in. They'll come in for a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, some kind of refreshment, maybe some food. There's always a little bit of something on hand. And then we hear their stories. And some of the stories that we were hearing were around socks. You'll remember, I think it was probably almost 2 years ago, that we started to collect socks, new socks that we could then be able to distribute. But this, over the last little while with the pandemic, we haven't been able to open our doors. People haven't been able to drop in. So we weren't able to meet that need when we knew it arose, when people came to us and asked. So what we started to do was to bag up some socks and just hang them from the front door. So that's service. That's service. Service is bringing in the food for the food bank and making sure it gets to COPE, and then COPE handing it out to people who are in need. Service is, finding the clothes that you've got that are still in really good shape, and so we can take them, we can share them in places where those who are in need of those kinds of things can find them. Our service is rooted, to a great extent, in the passage from Matthew 25, the one that Victoria shared. How do we meet those needs? How do we offer that hospitality? How do we serve our fellow men, women, and those who don't identify in that kind of binary way? That's how we do it. We listen to their stories, we find out what it is that we can do, and then we respond. But what's our mission? What's our mission? In our church, in every church, in Christianity as a whole, our mission is to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. To share the gospel of Jesus Christ in what we say and what we do. In the passage we heard from the book of James couples faith and works. Now, it's not a question of whether we can be saved by faith or saved by works. We're not. We're saved by grace. Jesus offers us salvation through grace. We can't do anything. We cannot do anything to earn it. We know that. The way we know that truth is true is through faith. We have been gifted with faith that tells us that we have received that grace, and that grace is available to everybody. Okay. But once you know that you've experienced salvation, once you know that forgiveness is yours, once you know that you are already in relationship with, and not only in relationship, but beloved by God, what do you do? And that's where works comes in. It's not that our works save us, but our works are an expression of our faith. Our works are an expression of how we live out those words of Jesus to love God and to love your neighbor. Our works are an expression of our love of neighbor and thereby an expression of our love of God. And so it's not enough. I'm sorry to tell you, and I know, but it's not enough to feed the hungry. We are called, because we are gospel people, to ask, why are people hungry? Why? I can give food to the food bank, but I have to ask, why do we need food banks? Do you know that in 1984, 1985, food banks were instituted as a institution by the government of the day? I'm not trying to be partisan here, so I'm not going to name anything, but the government of the day instituted food banks in order to get us through the recession. There was a recognition that people were going to be that people were going to be hurting, not able to afford, and so food banks. Now, food banks become part of the budgeting process of provinces. They don't have to increase social assistance because people who are on social assistance can always go to the food bank. That, my friends, is wrong. That is not gospel. That is not good news, and it is something that we as people of faith have to challenge. Have to challenge. It's not enough. It's not enough to find a shelter for someone who doesn't have a home. That is not enough. We need to ask, why are there people without homes? What is it that in a world where we are now talking about having to recognize trillionaires. So not billionaires, we're way past billionaires. We are now looking at the first person in all of history who is going to become a trillionaire. That is enough money. That's enough money to alleviate hunger 3 times over for generations. How is that just? How is it just for someone to have $1 trillion living in the same city as people who are struggling to keep the water on and at risk of losing the small piece of home that they have? How is it that in a country like Canada, where we are one of the wealthiest nations in the world, that not only in the big cities, not only in Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver, but in small places, Fort Erie, there are people who cannot find a place to live, who cannot find a house or an apartment where they can try to build a home. We need to challenge that. That's where mission comes in. Mission is the living out of Micah 6:8. Mission is seeking justice even when it hurts. And here's where, on this 96th anniversary of the United Church of Canada, in the midst of all of the news that we're hearing, here's where mission hurts. For generations, we as a church participated in a system. And I've spoken to people who have gone through the residential school system who have told me that they benefited. And that's fine. That's not the question that we have to face. The question that we have to face is, at what cost? And why was the system put in place in the first place? When the documentation tells us that the goal of a residential school was to erase the Indian from the child, to remove all cultural identity from that child, we have to ask, why? And perhaps those who were participating believed that they were doing something good. I'm not even here to ask that question. I'm not here to challenge what motivated people to become teachers in a residential school. I want to believe that it was done with the very best of intentions. But out of that system, we now know that in British Columbia, 215 children were found in an unmarked grave. In Saskatchewan, there were two more unmarked grave sites at different residential schools. In Manitoba, we know that there were unmarked graves in Brantford, and the fear is that the more we dive into it, the more we look, the more we're going to find. Our mission is to is to find a way back to a gospel-centered path. Our mission is to re-examine how we truly love our neighbor in the same way as we would want to love God. Our mission is to come into worship to lament and to confess, because through lamentation and through confession, that is the way we are going to find our way onto the path of reconciliation. And that path of reconciliation is the path that leads to the kingdom of God. Let us, as a church, commit to radical hospitality that welcomes everybody into a worship life that is vivid and vivacious and challenging, because it's out of that worship life, out of a grounding in the gospel and a following of Jesus Christ, it's out of that worship that we are going to hear the truth of the gospel, and we are going to be encouraged and challenged to live risk-taking mission while offering service. We will seek justice, but we will love kindness. We will uphold and meet the needs of those around us while challenging those in power to do better. That is where we're off to. I invite you to join me on the journey. And with that, I will say, thanks be to God. Amen.